Welcome to Egopedia, where we explore the mind behind the mask. Deep inside all of us lives a small but powerful force, the ego that refuses to lose. It whispers in silence, flares up in arguments, and shapes the way we love, compete, and survive today. We'll uncover how this little ego drives us and how understanding it might just set us free.
This video explores the psychological and behavioral mechanisms behind the human ego's resistance to loss, defeat, or perceived failure. Drawing from perspectives in cognitive psychology, emotional intelligence, and social dynamics, it uncovers how even the smallest perceived setbacks can activate powerful ego-driven reactions. The aim is to provide insight into how this little ego influences our daily lives, relationships, and decision-making, and how awareness and emotional regulation can liberate us from its grip. Meeting the little ego. Before we can turn ego into a weapon, a sharp tool for navigating power and negotiation, we need to meet it in its raw, untrained form. We call this the little ego. What is the little ego? It's the early version of your ego, the one you developed growing up. It reacts fast. It wants to be liked. It hates being wrong. It gets defensive. It wants to win, even when there's nothing to win. This ego isn't bad. It's just immature. Think of it like a child inside you, a voice that says, I have to prove myself. Or, if I lose, I'm worthless. The little ego shows up when someone criticizes you, when you feel ignored in a meeting, when someone else gets credit for your idea. It's that tight feeling in your chest, that sudden anger, or the urge to talk louder just to feel important. That's the little ego trying to protect you. But in negotiation, that kind of ego usually does more harm than good. Here's the key idea. We don't want to kill the ego. We want to train it. To do that, we must first recognize it. When you can see your little ego in action, in real time, you unlock the power to pause, to choose, to shift. This chapter is your first mirror. We're going to look at the common signs, thoughts, and emotions that come from the little ego. We'll explore how it acts in conversations, arguments, and deals. The goal isn't to shame this part of you. The goal is to understand it, because once you do, you stop being controlled by it. You start using it with skill, with strategy, and with intention. That's the first step in making ego your ally and your weapon. 2. The psychology of the ego's resistance to loss. One of the most powerful and primitive drivers of human behavior is the fear of loss, and the ego is its frontline soldier. The ego does not simply dislike losing, it experiences loss as a direct threat to its identity. When faced with the possibility of rejection, failure, or being perceived as less than, the ego doesn't just flinch, it fights back. But why? Psychologically, the ego is wired to protect your sense of self. It builds a story, a narrative about who you are, what you're worth, and how you should be treated. This story becomes your mental armor. And when that story is challenged even slightly, the ego resists. That resistance often shows up as denial, anger, defensiveness, or withdrawal. In negotiation, this resistance to loss plays a subtle but dangerous role. People will hold on to failing strategies just to avoid admitting they were wrong. They'll overvalue what they already have, a bias known as the endowment effect, and undervalue what others offer. They'll walk away from good deals just to save face, or refuse compromise because it feels like defeat, even when it's the smarter move. Loss doesn't have to be tangible, like money or power. It can be emotional or symbolic. Losing an argument, accepting someone else's idea, being perceived as less dominant, admitting you didn't know something. All of these feel like tiny ego deaths. And unless you become conscious of this dynamic, the ego will do anything to avoid them, even if it costs you real progress. This is why some people can't apologize, why others double down when they're clearly wrong, why pride ruins partnerships, families, and careers. In negotiation, understanding the ego's resistance to loss is critical, not just in others, but in yourself. Recognize when your discomfort is not about logic or fairness, but about ego pain. Train yourself to pause in those moments. Ask, am I protecting a principle or just protecting my pride? That question, simple as it is, can save deals, preserve relationships, and help you become a far more strategic communicator. 3. Manifestations in daily life. The ego isn't just some abstract psychological concept that only shows up in therapy sessions or deep self-reflection. It plays out loudly in the everyday moments of life. Once you begin to recognize its behavior, you'll see it everywhere, in conversations, in reactions, in choices, and especially in conflict. Let's break this down into common patterns. 1. The need to be right. This is one of the most common ego-driven habits. You may notice yourself interrupting others, defending your point even when it's clearly flawed, or subtly steering conversations back to your perspective. This isn't about truth, it's about control. The ego equates being wrong with being weak, so it fights to maintain the illusion of certainty. 2. Taking things personally. Someone offers a suggestion, and you hear it as a criticism. Someone forgets to include you in a meeting, and you interpret it as rejection. These overreactions are ego flare-ups. The ego is deeply sensitive to exclusion because it sees social validation as proof of value. Even small slights feel like threats to self-worth. 3. The desire to win, even when it doesn't matter. Whether it's a minor debate or a harmless disagreement, the ego often transforms neutral situations into status contests. Ever catch yourself pushing harder in an argument just to have the last word? That's ego. It wants to win, not for the outcome, but for the symbolism. 4. Avoiding vulnerability. Admitting you don't know something. Asking for help. Saying, "I made a mistake." These are simple acts, but to the ego, they feel like humiliation. So it resists. It creates a mask of competence, even at the cost of growth or connection. In daily life, this manifests as pretending, hiding, or withdrawing when you feel exposed. 5. Overcompensating through status symbols. Luxury items, name-dropping, chasing titles. These behaviors are not inherently wrong. But when they come from a place of trying to prove your worth, they're symptoms of ego insecurity. Insecure ego seeks external proof of value because it lacks internal grounding. 6. Silent competition in relationships. In friendships or partnerships, the ego may subtly compete. One-upmanship. Downplaying others' success. Feeling threatened when someone else shines. These small, often unspoken behaviors reveal an ego that defines itself by comparison rather than inner clarity. Why this matters. When ego rules your daily life, it silently shapes your decisions, not around what's best or true, but around what protects your image. This keeps you stuck in cycles of defensiveness, people-pleasing, avoidance, or control. But once you start noticing these patterns, something incredible happens. You gain choice. You can pause before reacting. You can ask, is this really about me? Or is it just my ego trying to protect a false sense of self? And that awareness? That's the beginning of personal freedom. 4. The cost of always needing to win. At first glance, the desire to win may seem like a strength. After all, winners are rewarded. They get respect, rewards, and recognition. But beneath the surface, the compulsion to always win, especially when driven by the ego, comes at a subtle but very real cost. The ego frames every interaction as a contest. Someone must come out on top. Someone else must lose. It sees negotiation, conversation, and even collaboration through the lens of dominance. If I don't win, I lose status. But real life, and especially successful negotiation, isn't built on winning alone. It's built on trust, flexibility, and mutual benefit. The ego that always needs to win can't see that. It believes that compromise is weakness, and that yielding even slightly is a threat to identity. This mindset has significant consequences. 1. Damaged relationships. People who always need to win create tension, not trust. Whether in business or personal life, others begin to feel manipulated, unvalued, or steamrolled. Over time, this breaks rapport. Even if you win the negotiation, you lose the connection, and in many fields, relationships are worth more than short-term victories. 2. Missed opportunities for growth. The person obsessed with being right doesn't listen. They wait for their turn to speak. This kills curiosity. It prevents learning. Growth requires humility, the ability to say, I don't know, or you might have a better idea. But when ego rules, those statements feel impossible. So the need to win stunts intellectual and emotional development. 3. Short-term wins, long-term losses. Ego-driven negotiation might bring quick wins, but it's rarely sustainable. If your counterpart feels humiliated, cornered, or used, they're less likely to work with you again. You may extract value once, but lose access to future deals, collaborations, or loyalty. 4. Constant mental exhaustion. Trying to win every interaction is exhausting. You're always on guard, always strategizing, always protecting an image. This creates internal tension, a subtle anxiety that follows you everywhere. Instead of flowing with the moment, you're calculating how to win it. 5. Identity inflation and fear of failure. The more you attach your identity to being a winner, the more fragile you become. One loss, one criticism, one failed negotiation, and the ego shatters. You begin to avoid risk, not because you lack skill, but because your sense of self is tied to an unbroken streak of success. Ironically, this fear makes you less bold and less effective. 5. Cultivating awareness and emotional flexibility. The ego thrives in unconsciousness. It feeds on autopilot reactions, emotional reactivity, and rigid narratives about who we think we are. The antidote is awareness. Not the kind of awareness that simply recognizes your environment, but the deeper, more introspective kind, the ability to observe your own mind in action. Cultivating this awareness is not a one-time realization. It's a practice. It means developing the mental habit of catching yourself in moments when your ego is hijacking your behavior. You begin to notice when you're trying to dominate a conversation, when you're closing off to feedback, or when you're reacting from fear, not logic. This awareness opens the door to emotional flexibility, the capacity to pause, shift perspective, and respond consciously instead of reacting blindly. Let's explore what this looks like in practice. 1. Observing without judgment. Start by watching your ego, like an observer. Notice your internal dialogue in real time. I need them to see I'm right. I don't want to admit I'm wrong. If I back down, they'll think I'm weak. These are not facts. They're ego stories. Instead of trying to shut them down or suppress them, simply notice them. Label the pattern. This creates space between your trigger and your reaction, and in that space, you regain power. 2. Responding instead of reacting. The ego reacts. Awareness responds. When you cultivate emotional flexibility, you gain the ability to pause, even if it's just for a moment, before you speak or act. This is where real negotiation power lies. You can ask yourself, what outcome do I really want here? Is this about connection or control? Am I choosing clarity or just trying to win? This moment of pause turns emotional volatility into strategic calm. 3. Making room for discomfort. Emotional flexibility also means being willing to feel uncomfortable without needing to fix it right away. The ego hates discomfort. It avoids it by deflecting, defending, or attacking. But real strength comes from sitting in discomfort with awareness. In negotiation, this might mean staying silent when you want to interrupt, letting someone express disagreement without immediately rebutting, admitting you don't have all the answers, and still holding your ground with dignity. Discomfort is not the enemy. Avoidance is. 4. Practicing micro-mindfulness in high-stakes moments. You don't need to meditate for 30 minutes to become self-aware. Even a 5-second breath can shift your mindset. Before entering a negotiation, a conversation, or a potentially triggering moment, pause and scan your state. Am I grounded? What am I trying to protect? Can I be open here and still strong? These micro-practices add up. They train your nervous system to stay calm, centered, and responsive. 5. Rewriting the internal narrative. The ego often speaks in absolutes. If I lose, I'm weak. If I show doubt, I lose power. If they disagree, I must convince them. To cultivate emotional flexibility, you need to rewrite those scripts. Try reframing. Letting go doesn't mean losing, it means leading. Disagreement doesn't threaten me, it helps me grow. I can be strong and open. These are the mental upgrades that turn your ego from a rigid defense system into a flexible, powerful tool. Awareness doesn't eliminate the ego, but it puts you in the driver's seat. Emotional flexibility doesn't make you soft, it makes you smart. And together, they help you stop fighting for dominance and start choosing influence. 6. Conclusion. Befriending the ego. The ego is not the enemy. It often gets demonized in self-help conversations, portrayed as a toxic, self-absorbed monster that must be destroyed. But that's not only unrealistic, it's counterproductive. The ego, when understood, is simply a psychological structure built for survival. It gives us identity. It helps us function in society. It gives us drive, boundaries, and voice. The problem isn't that we have an ego. The problem is when the ego runs the show, unchecked, reactive, and unaware. The real goal is not to kill the ego. The real goal is to befriend it, to build a conscious relationship with it. Think of the ego as a protective bodyguard. It wants to keep you safe. It wants to shield you from embarrassment, rejection, or uncertainty. But sometimes in trying to protect you, it ends up limiting you. That's where awareness comes in. You can thank the ego for its service, and then decide when to listen to it, and when to lead from a deeper place. 1. Integration, not erasure. When you integrate the ego, you don't reject it, you work with it. You let it give you strength without needing to dominate. You let it give you pride without falling into arrogance. You let it defend you, but only when necessary, not compulsively. Integration is what gives you internal harmony. You are no longer at war with yourself. 2. The ego as a signal. Instead of treating ego-driven reactions as something to repress, you begin to treat them as signals. If you feel triggered, defensive, or obsessive about being right, pause and ask, what is my ego trying to protect right now? Is there a fear beneath this reaction? Can I thank my ego and still choose a better response? When ego becomes a signal instead of a master, you upgrade from unconscious reaction to conscious strategy. 3. Compassion for the self. Befriending the ego also means developing self-compassion. Every time your ego acts out, when you brag, shut down, lash out, or avoid feedback, it's coming from a place of fear. That fear often formed years ago, in childhood, in failure, in moments when you felt small, unseen, or unsafe. So instead of punishing yourself for having an ego flare-up, you respond with curiosity. You ask, what am I afraid of? And more importantly, what do I really need right now? This inner dialogue is what turns self-awareness into healing. For the mature ego is a tool. When the ego is mature, integrated, and conscious, it becomes a powerful tool. In negotiation, it gives you confidence, without rigidity. In leadership, it gives you presence without dominance. In relationships, it helps you stand tall, without stepping on others. In failure, it helps you bounce back, without self-destruction. It's no longer your boss. It's your ally. Final thought. The ego isn't something to be crushed. It's something to be understood, shaped, trained, and ultimately befriended. When you stop fighting it and start working with it, you become free. Free to choose your responses. Free to lead with clarity. Free to negotiate from power, not fear. This is the turning point. The ego stops being your cage and starts becoming your compass.